She stepped out of her modest sedan, the tires crunching softly on the fine gravel driveway of the prestigious Belmont Ridge Golf Club. Wearing a sun-faded linen dress and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the noonday sun, she made her way toward the entrance, a soft smile on her face. As she reached the grand white pillars that framed the clubhouse doors, a tall man in a crisp green blazer stepped forward. He was the club's senior concierge, and his frown came almost instantly. "May I help you, ma'am?" he asked, eyeing her attire. "I have a lunch reservation for one," she said politely, "under the name Evelyn Pierce." The concierge hesitated. "I am afraid our dining room is reserved for members and their guests today." "I am aware," Evelyn replied calmly. "I was invited by Mr. Albright." That name should have changed everything. But instead, the concierge's eyes swept over her again, taking in the simple sandals, the worn-out handbag, the complete absence of designer logos, and then narrowed. "Mr. Albright did not mention anyone like you," he said coolly. "Perhaps you were mistaken." At that moment, two women in pastel golf skirts stepped around her, clutching designer handbags and laughing. The concierge's demeanor shifted instantly as he greeted them with practiced charm. Evelyn stepped aside, letting them pass, but the heat of humiliation had already crept up her neck. She had been here before, not at this club, but in this moment, judged, assumed, brushed off. "I will just wait outside," she said softly, turning toward the veranda. But the concierge had already made a small gesture, and within moments, another staff member approached. "I am going to have to ask you to leave the property," he said with the kind of politeness that carried a very sharp edge. "This is a private club." Evelyn paused. Then she nodded once. "Very well." She stepped back across the gravel, the crunch beneath her sandals suddenly feeling much louder. A few eyes followed her as she passed the main patio, where the well-dressed elite of Belmont Ridge enjoyed midday cocktails beneath large green umbrellas. Her chest felt tight, but her posture remained upright. She reached her car, opened the door, and sat silently for a moment with her hands resting on the steering wheel. Inside the clubhouse, the concierge returned to his post, brushing off the brief interruption like lint from his sleeve. He had done his duty after all. Maintaining the prestige of Belmont Ridge meant making difficult calls sometimes. He prided himself on that discernment. What he could not know, what none of them knew, was that Evelyn Pierce was no stranger to privilege. She simply did not advertise it. At 38 years old, she had spent most of her adult life as the backbone of several major philanthropic initiatives in the state, a quiet force behind the funding of children's hospitals, literacy programs, and veteran services. She preferred to let the work speak for itself. No press releases, no red carpets, just results. Before her marriage to Adrian Pierce, her name had appeared only in modest academic circles. She had written her doctoral thesis on cultural accessibility in architecture, and even now, she continued to teach part-time at a nearby college. But the Pierce name, and the legacy behind it, was another story entirely. Adrian Pierce was an engineer, inventor, and founder of one of the world's most successful sustainable infrastructure companies. Known for his aversion to flash and his love for innovation, he had spent over 2 decades building a fortune by helping the world prepare for the future. And Evelyn had been by his side since the beginning, long before the first billion, long before the world knew his name. Their estate, nestled in the quiet hills just 40 minutes outside the city, was understated by design. Modern, clean lines, earth tones, solar-powered everything. The garage, however, was Adrian's playground. Inside it sat one of the rarest car collections in the country, including a one-of-a-kind Bugatti, specially commissioned to commemorate his company's 15th anniversary. It had only been driven twice. Now, seated behind the wheel of her modest sedan, Evelyn reached for her phone. The heat of her embarrassment had cooled, but the sting lingered. She thought of the young women on the patio, the way they had looked through her. She thought of the concierge's smirk, the disbelief in his voice when he said, "Someone like you." Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. Then she called her husband. Back at the estate, Adrian Pierce was mid-conference call when his phone buzzed with her name. He stepped away from the discussion immediately. "Eve?" he asked. "I just got kicked out of Belmont Ridge," she said with a quiet laugh that was not really a laugh at all. There was a pause on his end. What happened? She recounted the story plainly, without drama. The expression, the tone, the look in their eyes. Adrian listened in silence. I was going to let it go, she admitted, but I keep thinking, how many others get treated that way? How many people leave that club humiliated just because they do not look the part? He did not answer immediately. Then, softly, you want to go back? No, she replied, but I think someone else should. And that was all he needed to hear. The Bellamont Ridge Golf Club sparkled under the early afternoon sun, its immaculate greens stretched for acres, framed by centuries-old oaks and winding cart paths. Inside, the dining hall buzzed with polite laughter, clinking glasses, and the subtle perfume of power. Guests in pressed polo shirts and designer sunglasses enjoyed imported wine and seared salmon, while the concierge returned to his post, none the wiser. Exactly 57 minutes after Evelyn had been escorted out, the soft hum of something extraordinary crept over the horizon. At first it was subtle, a note just slightly off from the steady rhythm of luxury vehicles coming and going. Then it grew louder, richer, deeper, unmistakably rarer. As the sound reached the circular drive, conversations paused, heads turned, forks stopped midair. The vehicle that glided into view did not belong to the country club crowd. It was a custom Bugatti, low-slung and impossibly sleek, the paint shifting in color from emerald green to deep obsidian depending on how the sunlight hit it. The logo on the front was unmistakable, but the model, well, it was not one anyone had ever seen before. That was because only one existed. Adrian Pierce stepped out of the driver's side with the ease of someone who knew the weight of the moment, but did not need to flaunt it. Tall, composed, dressed in a simple gray suit with no tie, he had the kind of presence that drew silence rather than demanded it. The concierge, now half a step back from his post, blinked rapidly. "Sir, may I help you?" Adrian regarded him with a calm that somehow felt sharper than anger. "Yes," he said, "I am looking for someone who works here." He would have turned away a woman in a linen dress earlier today, told her she did not belong. The color drained from the concierge's face. I was not aware." "You will be," Adrian said. The club's manager, having been summoned by the commotion outside, arrived breathless at the front door just in time to witness the exchange. "Mr. Pierce," he said quickly, recognizing the name not from face but from press and corporate dealings. We had no idea your wife had arrived. Please extend our sincerest apologies." "Sincerity," Adrian said, "is not something that can be requested. It is either practiced or it is not." The dining guests now pressed subtly against the windows, some pretending not to stare, others making no such effort. "My wife came here under her own name," Adrian continued. "She was polite. She had a reservation, and she was turned away because she did not look like what you expected." The manager swallowed hard, nodding with increasing desperation. Yes, I understand. There will be disciplinary action." "I am not interested in someone losing their job," Adrian interrupted. "I am interested in whether this place is capable of learning anything at all." The doors opened behind them, and Evelyn stepped out, having arrived in a second car at her husband's request. She joined him silently, her presence a quiet confirmation of everything he had said. The manager's voice caught in his throat. "Mrs. Pierce, please, we are not here for lunch," Evelyn said. "We are here to make a point." At that moment, the head of the club board arrived, having been contacted by a frantic junior employee. He was older, silver-haired, and immediately recognized the danger unfolding on his front step. "Mr. and Mrs. Pierce," he began, "I assure you this is not how our club treats people." "It is exactly how your club treats people," Evelyn said evenly, "because it is exactly what happened." The board member attempted to redirect the conversation, offering private dinners, honorary memberships, donations made in the Pierce name to local charities the club supported. Adrian's hand rose, stopping the flood of words. "We do not need a table," he said. "We have our own, and we will not be giving you our name to clean your record." The Bugatti behind them shimmered as clouds shifted above. Its presence alone, its singularity, was now burned into the minds of every person watching. "What I do want," Adrian said, "is for you to host a community event. one that is open to the public, no reservations, no dress code, just people, children, parents, grandparents. Let them walk these grounds that have been closed off to them. Let them see that you remember who built this town. And if you are afraid they might not look the part, then perhaps it is the part that needs changing. The board member, speechless, nodded slowly. I I think we can make that happen. Then perhaps there is hope for you yet, Evelyn said. She turned to her husband, and they walked away together, not toward the car, but toward the gardens, hand in hand. Behind them, no one knew what to say. Not the staff, not the members, not the board. Because in that moment, they had not just seen a rare car or a powerful man. They had seen the weight of dignity carried by someone they had judged too soon. And it was heavier than wealth. It was rarer than status. It was earned. The Pierce estate sat quietly atop Windmere Hill, surrounded by trees that whispered in the evening breeze. The house itself remained calm and grounded, its sleek architecture blending into the land as though it had grown there rather than been built. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed but not heavy. Evelyn prepared tea in the kitchen while Adrian made a series of phone calls from his home office. Neither of them raised their voice. Neither of them rushed. The situation was already in motion. The real work, as they both knew, was not in shouting, but in shaping what would follow. Adrian's final call was to Nora Whitfield, director of the Children's Unity Initiative, a local program that provided outdoor education and recreational access for underprivileged youth. Evelyn had worked with her for years, and both she and Adrian knew that Nora had been trying to find a venue for their summer youth outreach fair. Every door had been closed so far, until now. Adrian explained what had happened that afternoon at Belmont Ridge. Then he offered the entire club's grounds for the event. Nora's silence on the other end was brief but electric. "You are serious?" she finally asked. "Completely," Adrian replied. "I believe it is time that Belmont Ridge learns what it means to welcome people." By the time he hung up, the plan had taken form. Evelyn joined him at his desk, setting his tea down gently. "You are not angry," she said, watching his expression. "You are calm. That worries me more." "Anger," Adrian replied, "is reactive. But this is something else." She smiled at him, and he smiled back. The following week, invitations went out, not to the usual circles of donors and dignitaries, but to local schools, community centers, shelters, and family programs. Transportation was arranged, meals were planned, activities were designed for children with every kind of background and ability. It was called Open Greens, and it would be the first time in the golf club's 92-year history that its manicured grounds would be used for anything other than elite recreation. When the day arrived, the contrast was immediate. Instead of European cars idling at the gates, there were school buses. Instead of custom golf bags, there were strollers and backpacks and coolers packed by hand. Instead of silence on the greens, there was laughter, music, and the delighted shouts of children discovering the joy of wide open space. The members of Belmont Ridge had been given a choice: attend and volunteer, or simply step aside. Many had chosen to watch from the clubhouse windows. Others, reluctantly at first, agreed to guide activities or serve lemonade. But what they witnessed began to change them. A 12-year-old boy in a wheelchair raced a volunteer across the putting green. A group of sisters planted flower beds by the West Trail entrance. An elderly woman with a cane gave putting lessons to a group of wide-eyed first graders, telling them stories about her father who had once worked as a groundskeeper on the very course they now played on. And through it all, Evelyn and Adrian moved quietly, smiling, helping where needed, refusing any attention. That was never the point. By mid-afternoon, the man who had originally turned Evelyn away, the concierge in the green blazer, stood near the entrance, holding open the doors and greeting each arriving family with a quiet welcome. No one asked him to. He simply stood there, observing what dignity looked like when it was not worn like a badge but offered like a gift. Near the main pavilion, Nora Whitfield approached Evelyn. "I do not know what you did," she said, eyes sweeping across the joyful scene, "but this feels like a miracle." "Not a miracle," Evelyn replied. "Just a reminder. People forget what a shared space means, and how rare it is to feel truly seen." She looked across the fairgrounds and spotted the club board member assisting a group of children with arts and crafts. His jacket sleeves were rolled up. His face was sunburned. And for the first time in recent memory, he was not thinking about status. Later that evening, as the last buses pulled away and the grounds grew quiet again, Evelyn stood at the edge of the field with Adrian. The sunset bathed the estate in warm light, casting long shadows across the greens. "Do you think they learned anything?" she asked. Adrian considered the question. "Some will, others might not. But it is not about what they do next. It is about what we choose to do with what we know now." "And what is that?" she asked softly. "That power," he said, "is not in being exclusive. It is in opening the gate and choosing to see people for who they are." She nodded slowly, her hand finding his. "Then I think we used ours well today." "You always do," he said. And they stood there together, in the silence that follows change, knowing the echoes of this day would linger far longer than any one moment of humiliation or pride. The following morning, Bellamont Ridge Golf Club returned to its usual rhythm. Groundskeepers trimmed hedges with quiet precision, servers polished silver in the dining room, and members strolled through the lobby in designer loafers and linen slacks. But something felt different, though no one could quite name it. The air seemed heavier. A few of the younger staff whispered about the event from the day before. The older ones said nothing at all. In his office near the back of the clubhouse, the concierge sat unusually still. The green blazer he wore every day now felt like a weight on his shoulders. The images from yesterday looped in his mind. Not the rare Bugatti, not the cold stare from Adrian Pierce, but the children, the laughter. The way Evelyn Pierce had stood with complete grace as he, without even knowing her, had treated her as less than worthy. He rubbed his hands together once, then stood and walked toward the manager's office. "I need to speak with you," he said. The conversation that followed was quiet and brief. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not make excuses. What he asked for, instead, was permission to continue opening the door, to greet every guest the same way, regardless of their clothing or their title or their last name. The manager looked up, surprised, and then slowly nodded. "Yes," he said. "Yes, you should." Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Evelyn returned to her routine without ceremony. She visited the library. She stopped by the community garden where she volunteered. She dropped off art supplies at the local shelter. She answered emails from students and finalized planning documents for her next accessibility project. There were no interviews, no headlines, no social media statements. She simply went on with her life, quiet, steady, unshaken. Adrian, on the other hand, found his schedule suddenly filled with requests. The board of Belmont Ridge invited him to discuss future partnerships. The mayor's office reached out with interest in expanding the Open Greens initiative citywide. A few neighboring clubs even requested consultation on hosting similar events, hoping to rehabilitate their image before they were ever called out. Adrian responded politely but turned most of them down. He had no interest in fixing optics, only culture. The only meeting he did accept was with a quiet-faced teenager who had attended the Open Greens Day with her younger brother. She had written a letter thanking him and asking if she could interview him for her school newspaper. Adrian invited her to the estate. They sat together under the pergola in the back garden, sipping lemonade as the late summer light flickered through the trees. She asked simple, thoughtful questions about fairness, about spaces, about what it meant to be excluded. Adrian answered them all with honesty. "It is not about letting people in," he said. "It is about questioning why they were ever kept out." The girl nodded and took notes. Before she left, she asked if she could see the car. Adrian laughed softly. "Which one?" She smiled. "The green one." He led her to the garage and pulled back the cover. The Bugatti shimmered under the soft lights. Her eyes widened, but she said nothing at first. She just looked. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "But I think what you did was even better." Adrian smiled. "Cars can only go so far," he said. "People, they can take us anywhere." She left shortly after, and Adrian returned to his workshop, tinkering with a new design prototype. He had a habit of returning to his hands when the world felt too loud. It was his way of grounding himself, of remembering what mattered. A few days later, Evelyn received a letter at her office. It was handwritten on thick stationery and sealed in an envelope with the Belmont Ridge crest. She opened it slowly and read the first line. Dear Mrs. Pierce, I owe you not only an apology but a debt of understanding. It was from the concierge. He detailed how he had behaved, how little he had questioned his own assumptions, and how deeply the events of that day and what followed had changed him. He asked for nothing, only that she knew he was listening now. Evelyn folded the letter gently and placed it in a drawer beside her desk. Then she returned to her work. She had students to mentor, buildings to help redesign, children to advocate for. The world was wide, and there was much still to do. But in quiet pockets across the city, inside clubs, inside offices, inside homes, people had started to talk differently, to think more carefully, and in small, invisible ways, things began to shift. All because one woman chose dignity over drama, one man chose reflection over rage, and both of them believed that the world could be better, not louder, not richer, not shinier, but kinder. It would never make headlines, but it would make a difference. 1 month later, the Open Greens event had become something of a legend in town. Articles appeared in local newspapers, radio hosts shared anecdotes from families who had attended, and school children wrote thank you letters to the Pierce family. But what stayed with people most was not the extravagance of the rare car or the identity of the man who had driven it. It was the image of a woman in a linen dress standing with perfect poise outside a place that had denied her, only to return through a different kind of door, one made not of privilege but of principle. Meanwhile, Belmont Ridge Golf Club faced a slow but certain transformation. It did not happen overnight, but over time, new policies were quietly introduced. Dress codes were reviewed, community partnerships were considered, a new scholarship fund was created, sponsored anonymously, but everyone knew who was behind it. And inside the clubhouse, more staff began to follow the concierge's lead. The green blazered gatekeeper had become something of a symbol, not for rejection, but for growth. His attitude had shifted so drastically that members who once supported his firm stance were now mirroring his gentler approach. He had learned something powerful, that prestige did not come from guarding a gate, but from opening it. One afternoon, as the summer gave way to a gentle autumn, he found himself standing once again at the entrance as a woman approached. She wore simple sneakers, a worn-out backpack, and looked around hesitantly. She was there for a job interview in the kitchen, having taken 2 buses to get there. She started to speak, unsure of where to go, but he stopped her, not with a raised hand, but with a smile. "Come with me," he said warmly. "Let me show you the way." Across the city, at a small art exhibition held in a refurbished warehouse, Evelyn moved quietly from canvas to canvas. The show featured the work of local children from underserved schools. Each piece was vibrant, chaotic, and breathtaking in its honesty. She paused in front of one painted by a young girl named Lydia. It depicted a woman standing beside a strange green car, surrounded by swirling clouds and golden light. At the bottom, the caption read, "The Lady Who Opened the Garden." Evelyn smiled and blinked back a tear. The curator, a friend from one of her outreach programs, came up beside her. "She said the lady looked like you," the curator whispered. Evelyn said nothing at first. Then she nodded. "I think it looks like all of us," she said, "when we are seen." That same night, Evelyn and Adrian hosted a modest dinner at their home. Nothing extravagant, just friends, neighbors, colleagues, and a few new faces from the Open Greens event. The fireplace crackled, the wine flowed, the food was simple and hearty. Near the end of the evening, someone raised a toast. "To Evelyn," they said, "for teaching this city that grace is louder than judgment." Evelyn laughed softly, touched but embarrassed. "It was not just me," she replied. "It was everyone who decided to see things differently. That is how change begins." Later, as the last guest left and the night settled over the hills, Evelyn and Adrian stood side by side on the back patio, looking out over their property. The moonlight painted everything in silver. "You know," Adrian said, "I think that Bugatti did more good in that 1 hour than in all the time it has sat in that garage." Evelyn chuckled. "Maybe," she said, "but it was never about the car." "No," he agreed. "It was about the drive." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they stood there, quiet and content. the air filled with the kind of peace that comes from knowing you have done something that matters, not for applause, not for credit, but because it was right. In a world so often driven by appearances, they had chosen substance, and in doing so, they had changed more than just minds. They had changed hearts. As autumn deepened and the trees wore coats of amber and gold, Bellamont Ridge began preparing for its annual Founders Gala. Traditionally a grand affair reserved for donors, board members, and select guests, the event had long stood as a symbol of exclusivity. But this year, things were different. Quiet conversations began weeks earlier. Suggestions were made. Voices that had once gone unheard were now being consulted. The gala committee, which had always been a closed circle, suddenly found itself welcoming a broader group to the planning table. Evelyn was one of those voices. She had not asked to be included, but when invited, she did not refuse. She attended the meetings without fanfare, contributed without dominating, and slowly helped the group see that tradition did not have to mean exclusion. "This event has always been about honoring those who built this place," she said during one meeting. "Maybe it is time we honored all the hands that shaped it, from the gardeners to the teachers, the parents, the volunteers, everyone who made this town stronger." The committee, composed of old money and new influencers alike, listened, and this time they did not resist. When the evening of the gala finally arrived, the scene was nothing short of transformative. The grand lawn was still illuminated by chandeliers and warmed by tented heaters. The catering was still elegant, and the string quartet still played in the background. But the guest list had changed. In attendance were not only those whose names graced donation plaques, but also local leaders, nurses, teachers, single parents, community organizers, and small business owners. They arrived in modest cars and tailored suits, borrowed dresses and handmade jewelry, and they were greeted, not evaluated. Adrian stood near the entrance, welcoming guests with quiet sincerity. Evelyn moved among them like sunlight, pausing to speak with each person, asking about their families, their stories, their dreams. No one was ignored. No one was made to feel out of place. Near the back of the pavilion, the concierge stood alongside a young man in a white apron, the same kitchen applicant he had welcomed weeks earlier. Now a full-time employee, the young man was helping coordinate the evening's meal service. "It is beautiful, is it not?" the concierge said softly, watching the room fill with laughter and clinking glasses. The young man nodded. "Feels like everyone belongs here." The concierge smiled, a little sad and a little proud. That is how it should have felt all along. As the night unfolded, speeches were given, awards were presented, and near the end, Nora Whitfield was invited to the stage. She spoke of the Open Greens Initiative, of children who had touched grass for the first time, of parents who had cried just watching their kids run without barriers. Then she paused and looked out at the crowd. "We all talk about legacy," she said. "We talk about what we leave behind. But tonight, I want us to think about what we open up. What doors, what hearts, what minds." She turned toward Evelyn and Adrian, because sometimes legacy is not about what has been built. It is about what has been unblocked. The room rose to its feet in applause, not for spectacle, but for truth. Later that evening, Evelyn found herself standing alone under a tree near the edge of the lawn, the soft light of the gala casting long shadows behind her. She watched guests dance and children sneak extra desserts and elders lean in close to share stories with new friends. Adrian approached quietly, 2 glasses of cider in hand. He offered one to her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She sipped her drink and took a deep breath. That sometimes the best things grow in places we never expected. And sometimes change starts with something as small as standing still when someone tells you to leave. Adrian looked out over the crowd. "You did more than stand still." "Maybe," she said, "but I think the important thing is that we stayed steady, and we spoke up, and we gave people a reason to reconsider." "That is what leadership looks like," he said. She tilted her head toward him. "You have a garage full of luxury cars, and you just called that leadership?" He laughed, a warm and quiet sound. "Touché." They stood there for a long moment, watching the world they had nudged just slightly into a better shape. And as the stars came out one by one, it was not the chandelier lights or the designer dresses that left the deepest impression. It was the feeling, the palpable sense that something rare had happened, that a space once closed had opened, that a place once guarded had softened, and that perhaps the next person who walked through those doors in worn-out shoes and a hopeful heart would not be questioned, but welcomed. The next morning, the front page of the city's local paper carried a photo from the gala. It showed Evelyn and Adrian standing together in the soft glow of string lights, surrounded by guests who looked nothing like the traditional Belmont Ridge crowd. The headline read, "The couple who redefined the guest list." But Evelyn did not see it until much later. She was already on the road, driving herself to a local high school where she was scheduled to speak to a group of seniors about civic design and inclusion. She brought no assistant, no presentation team, and no printed biography, just a folder with her notes and a heart full of purpose. She spoke to the students not about wealth or reputation, but about visibility, about what it meant to walk into a space and not see yourself reflected, and how the smallest act of welcome could change someone's world. She told them a story, not about a car, but about a door that was closed to her, and how, instead of pounding on it, she simply built another way through. She described dignity not as something to demand, but something to carry. She told them how quiet choices ripple farther than loud ones, and how the most powerful change often begins in silence. Her words were not rehearsed, but they were lived. She had no slides or buzzwords, just honesty. And when she finished, a girl in the front row raised her hand and asked, "How do you know when to say something, even if it feels uncomfortable?" Evelyn smiled gently. "When your silence would feel worse." Another student, a boy near the window, spoke up too. "What if people laugh at you or tell you that you are wrong?" Evelyn looked at him, holding his gaze with calm conviction. "Then you thank them silently for showing you where the work is hardest. You do not push them, you grow around them, like water around a rock, because one day they might see the river you helped create." Afterward, the principal pulled her aside and said, "You have no idea how much they needed to hear that, especially from someone who does not look like the world they are taught to chase." Evelyn just smiled. They will build a better one. At Belmont Ridge, meanwhile, another kind of education was happening. The club's leadership, prompted by Adrian and reinforced by the board's new perspective, had begun working with an equity consultant. Staff attended training sessions not just on bias, but on hospitality in its truest form. They learned to look people in the eye, to listen, to ask before assuming, to treat every visitor as someone worthy of dignity. They were reminded that excellence does not come from exclusion. It comes from presence, from care, from consistency. The process was not always smooth. Old habits resisted. Pride occasionally flared. But something had shifted. There was a different kind of energy in the air, an awareness that had never existed before. The way doors were opened, the way names were spoken, the way assumptions were caught before they became actions. One afternoon, Daniel, a young man who had joined the service staff not long after Open Greens, stood at the concierge desk beside the man in the green blazer. He had seen the changes firsthand. "Do you ever wish it had happened differently?" he asked carefully. The concierge, now more reflective than proud, considered the question. "I wish I had looked closer," he said. "Not at her clothes, at her, at myself." Daniel nodded. "But you did, eventually." "Eventually," the concierge repeated softly. "But sometimes, eventually is too late for some people. That is why we must learn faster." He paused, then added, "That is why I stay at this door now. Not to turn people away, but to make sure I am ready to welcome them." Outside, the golf course remained the same, impeccably groomed, calm, serene. But within its gates, people moved with more awareness now. And those who returned, those who had once been turned away, found something different in the way they were greeted, something softer, something more human. Back at the Pierce estate, Adrian stood at the edge of the garage, looking once again at the Bugatti. It had been cleaned since that first visit to the club, its emerald surface gleaming like the day it had arrived. He opened the driver's side door, sat down, and simply rested his hands on the steering wheel. He did not turn the key. He just sat. A few minutes later, Evelyn appeared, leaning on the frame of the garage door. "Taking it for another lesson?" she asked playfully. Adrian looked up at her, smiled, just thinking about how much attention this car got and how none of it mattered in the end. It mattered, Evelyn said, not because of what it was, but because of what it showed them. He nodded. I just wish we did not need to prove we're through. Shock. I wish people recognized value before they saw a price tag. That is the work, she said. That is the real drive. They locked eyes for a moment, sharing an understanding built not on statements or showdowns, but on years of choosing the quiet path, the harder path, the one that required patience, empathy, and resilience. They stepped out into the fading light, their shadows long and peaceful behind them. Inside the house, a thank you note sat on the counter, hand-delivered that morning by the new club president. It simply read, "You taught us how to host again. Truly host. We will not forget it." Evelyn picked it up, read it again, and smiled faintly. I hope they remember, she murmured. Not just today, but when the next Evelyn shows up. And the next, they will, Adrian said, because you changed the story. Weeks passed. The world kept spinning. But the story of what had happened at Belmont Ridge stayed alive, not because of gossip, but because it had become something more than a story. It had become a reference point, a reminder. In classrooms, teachers used it to talk about integrity. In boardrooms, executives brought it up during diversity sessions. In living rooms, parents shared it with their children to explain what it means to judge or to choose not to. And in quiet moments, people remembered it when faced with their own assumptions. Evelyn Pierce had become a kind of quiet symbol, not because she asked for it, but because she had shown the kind of grace people rarely forget. Blake Thompson, the sales manager from Boston Luxury Motors, whose fall from grace had once gone viral, had also heard the story. He read about it one morning in an industry newsletter. There was no mention of names, no viral footage this time, just a quiet, dignified recounting of how a woman had been misjudged and how a community responded not with revenge, but with reformation. And it hit him like a mirror, because Blake, too, had once dismissed someone based on what they wore, based on what he assumed they could not possibly afford. He had learned that lesson the hard way, publicly, painfully, but also powerfully. Now, he ran a dealership that no longer qualified buyers based on appearance. The welcome desk was staffed by employees trained in empathy first, product knowledge second. Every customer, regardless of what they wore, was greeted the same way, with eye contact, respect, and curiosity. Blake had stayed involved with the adaptive sports initiative he was once sentenced to support. What began as penance had become a passion. He still remembered Thomas, the boy in the wheelchair, who had first made him laugh again after everything fell apart. Thomas was taller now, more confident, and Blake had become a regular volunteer coach in his basketball group. Blake smiled at the memory and leaned back in his chair. Then he made a call to an old friend who now ran events for car dealerships across the state. "Let us sponsor something real," he said, "something open to everyone, something that reminds us why people matter more than Polish." His friend was quiet on the other end for a moment, then said, "You have changed." Blake replied, "No, I just finally saw what I should have seen from the start." And just like that, the impact of Evelyn Pierce's quiet resistance rippled outward again. It crossed city lines, it crossed industries, it slipped into hearts and boardrooms and broken places in need of repair. The woman who had been dismissed for wearing a linen dress had created a pattern others could follow. Not through speeches or hashtags or campaigns, but through the simple, steady refusal to return what had been thrown at her. Instead of defensiveness, she offered awareness. Instead of noise, she offered clarity. And in doing so, she allowed others to look at themselves without fear, without shame, and decide who they wanted to become next. And all of it came from a single moment, a moment where she could have shouted or stormed out or escalated. But she did not. She stood in her linen dress, shoulders back, voice calm, and walked away. Not because she was defeated, but because she was rising. Not because she was silent, but because she was preparing to be heard in a different way. 1 hour later, her husband arrived with a car most people would never see in their lifetime. But even that, the Bugatti, the symbol of wealth and rarity, was not the point. The point was how they used it, not to shame, not to boast, but to reflect, to challenge assumptions, to hold up a mirror and ask, who do we think belongs here and why? Why are the doors of elegance always locked to the ones who walk with humility? And why does the world only learn to listen when the loudest symbol of power arrives to speak a truth the quiet already knew? In the end, the story was never about money. It was never about power. It was about perspective. Evelyn Pierce did not just walk back into the world she had been denied. She helped rebuild it into something better. Not perfect, not polished, but kinder, wiser, more awake. A world where a child can run across country club grass for the first time. A world where a teenager paints a portrait of the lady who opened the garden. A world where even the ones who once turned people away now stand to hold the door open. And that is something even the rarest car in the world cannot buy. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. We all carry judgments, often without knowing it. But as Evelyn showed us, how we respond to those moments, how we use our voice, our presence, and our values can change everything. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance or been misjudged yourself? Let us know in the comments below. Your story might help someone else look a little deeper next time. And remember, the true measure of worth is not written on a price tag or stitched into fabric. It is in how we treat others when no one important is watching. See you in our next story, where another powerful lesson awaits.